Hello everyone. The Toyota Yaris GRMN will always hold a very special place in my heart. You see, about 18 months ago I was invited by Toyota to Spain to test drive this then brand new car. And that was amazing because I had never ever gone on any sort of official do or launch or event before, and the guys from Toyota just contacted me completely out of the blue and asked me to come along. And for me, having then already spent a good 18 months working hard at making this YouTube channel a success, it was a real validation of what I was doing, and I'll be infinitely grateful to Andy and the Toyota team for having me out there. And the car was an absolute blast. However, I never really got to drive the Yaris back home. There was never an opportunity to drive it in the United Kingdom. I actually drove it a second time on a frozen lake in Sweden, which was an awful lot of fun, but doesn't really tell you an awful lot about how a car will handle your favourite back road. However, thanks to channel viewer Scott, I am now able to tell you what it is like, and I think now's as good a time as any because, well, the GRMN story has sort of nearly been a little bit forgotten. I think everyone got kind of wrapped up in the whole sort of Supra business, and these have been almost completely forgotten. In fact, there are still a number of these sat in dealerships around the country with essentially no miles on them whatsoever. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. Number one, they were very expensive when they came out. From memory, list price was about £27,000, and that's a hell of a lot more than, let's say, a Fiesta ST. And on the face of it, you might not understand really why that will possibly be the case. Now, I'm not going to make today's video all that long or all that in depth because I already went through all of the many changes made to this car on my first video, which I'm going to link to you right about now, and there'll be a link up here somewhere or other for you to click and go and watch that video. Suffice it to say, this was not just a normal ordinary Yaris with a slightly hot engine lumped in there. In fact, this did actually really stand out. I mean, this was over 100 horsepower more powerful than the next fastest Yaris. This is a totally different beastie. Getting back in the saddle of one of these for the first time in about 15 months, the first thing that strikes me is how tall I am in this car. You sit very high indeed. It's a very classic kind of city car, super mini type thing. Next thing is how much I love this steering wheel, which is lifted directly from the second generation GT86, and also these seats, which are bespoke to the Yaris GRMN, and Toyota at the time were very proud to tell me were made by the exact same people who made the seats for the Lexus LFA, so there's a little bit of heritage. Otherwise in here, it's a sort of mixture of nice bespoke GRMN bits and kind of very cheap, nasty looking entry-level Japanese switchgear, and that's a little bit of a shame. So it's a real mixed bag. Like, it doesn't feel overall like a cheap interior, but neither does it feel like a particularly premium interior. I mean, if you're currently eyeing up something like a BMW 1 Series, you'd certainly look down on this. However, fancy interiors is not at all what this car is about. This car is about the driving experience first and foremost, and this car is really a continuation of Toyota's program of building driver-focused cars that I guess you could almost say started in the modern era with the GT86 and it's carried on. This car, in fact, is actually quicker than a GT86. And its owner arrived in this because he was originally looking at a newer MX-5 with the Skyactiv X engine in it, and then when his dealer was unable to kind of make one of those materialise after many, many months of promises, he went and test drove a GT86, which he wasn't particularly in love with, and then saw this in the showroom, which happened to be essentially a cancelled order. So someone had put their name down for it, the dealership had got it, it'd come in, and then it basically hung around. And that's when Scott snapped it up. Wisely, I would say. These were about a second faster in the 0 to 60 dash than the GT86. And that's thanks to that engine up front, which, just to give you a brief recap, is a 1.8 litre supercharged 4-cylinder motor, exactly the same setup as is in the current Lotus Elise. And the only modification made to this one is the addition of a cone filter, which means that you can really hear that supercharger. I don't recall being able to hear it all that well before. The car sounds nice and meaty from outside because it is of the era where it managed to get in before you had to put petrol particulate filters in the exhausts. Now, the prototypes of these sounded really, really super meaty, but the production versions were tamed quite significantly. Well, basically, I think because they would never ever have passed regs if they didn't. But these engines, if you uncork them, do sound very, very tasty. Quoted power is about 210 horsepower. Torque isn't amazing, but it is nice to have an engine which really does need revs to do its best. The car revs really keenly all the way to 7,000, and in those last couple of thousand RPM, you can hear it just pulling that air in. It's quite an addictive little note, and this car absolutely does not feel lacking in the power department whatsoever. Steering is good too. It's not crazy responsive on the off-center, but it's got just the right weight to it, and you can feel plenty through this rack. The chassis is pretty stiff, and the suspension equally so, but it's not punishing at all. And when I drove this, it was on Spanish roads, which for the most part are much better than you would possibly imagine. This car also has a proper mechanical limited slip differential up the front, which does mean that if you want to be fully committed or take this car on track, as I have, you can carry some quite silly speeds through the corners. One of my few criticisms is the pedal placement. The brake and throttle pedal are just a little bit too far away. I've got my driving shoes on today because I knew I was driving this car, and I've got very wide feet, so I generally buy the narrowest shoes I possibly can for driving in, and actually there's just too much of a gap between those two pedals for me to be able to heel and toe successfully, which is a shame. Now, in practical terms, this car is actually not that bad. It's been averaging about 34 miles to the gallon, which for a hot hatch is pretty damn good. The whole car feels solid with no creaks and rattles other than my camera over here. And it's a pretty nice place to be. Once you're kind of settled into it and you sort of ignore the dash, you've got a very good view out. This A pillar is not too intrusive at all. The B pillar is set way back, so when you're trying to pull out of junctions and do things like that, it doesn't get in the way. Now, I do recall Toyota at the time saying that they just couldn't really afford to do anything with the bodywork to make this car any bigger or wider or meaner than the regular car beyond what they've already done, because there simply wasn't the budget for it, which it makes sense when you're only going to make 600 of these. And if you do want something that is quite rare, well, I can't actually think I've seen more than maybe one Yaris GRMN on the roads since they came out. That says an awful lot. What I do keep seeing is the little Yaris and the Igo in white with the black and red stickers on it, as this car has, and that's slightly annoying because I keep seeing them thinking, oh, it's a GRMN, then I'm like, no, it's not at all, it's just stickers on a white Toyota hatch. One of the few downsides of this as a practical everyday car is because Toyota used the chassis and the subframes from the hybrid version of this car, because they were stiffer, they also had to use a smaller fuel tank. So this car does have a relatively short range, but that is a fairly minor criticism. So what went wrong with the little Yaris? Why are there still examples sat in the showrooms unsold? I love the car. Loads of other people loved the car. It's a really fun car. Well, I think it's pretty simple, to be honest. Most younger people buying hot hatches want what kind of everybody else has. They want the popular best value option, and that's always going to be something like the Fiesta. They were a hell of a lot cheaper than one of these, a huge amount cheaper. And the Fiesta, being turbo, was very moddable. That's always very popular. These, being rare and unusual, mean that the aftermarket scene just isn't going to be that good. People, I don't think, really understood them. I don't think they appreciated the level of engineering that went into them. And to be honest, most 19 to 25-year-olds, which is the sort of hatch marketplace, I don't think they're really big into these kind of fancy engineering exercises either. To really get what the car's about, you do have to drive it, and because they're so rare, very few people ever actually did. And ultimately, Toyota said that you couldn't have one anyway, because they were all kind of sold out, which they were certainly all allocated. That's absolutely not misinformation on Toyota's part at all. But dealers obviously had a few kicking around, and they were still asking serious money for them, and so they're one of these little chapters in history that's been sadly forgotten. And it is truly sad that has happened, because this is a brilliant car. And I really genuinely hope that Toyota do have another go at it. I've said this from day one, that I really hope this doesn't sit as a one-off. Toyota and hot hatches have always had a bit of an odd relationship. The Corolla T-Sport was never really that loved. And this actually didn't get brilliant reviews. It got like 3.5, 4-star reviews. It criticised quite a few things about the car, often the price. But when you understand what they had to do to build it and how few they built, I think that price actually is totally justifiable. It's just difficult to explain it in the context of a Fiesta ST, but then if you went to a car meet, you're going to be able to walk from one side of to the other on Fiesta STs, and these, well, I just don't see them. Its natural rival would be something like the Peugeot 208 by Peugeot Sport, which I drove recently. That actually has a much nicer interior than this, but this drives better. The engine is far nicer, far sexier, and it's just to me, a slightly more enjoyable thing. Gear shifting this is much better than the Peugeots, which was not good at all. The steering wheel in both cars is kind of fun and small, but yeah. Sad really the little Yaris never really got the love that it deserved, because I think it's a cracking car. There you go, there's a second look at it. Does it work on British B roads? Yes, absolutely. Huge amount of fun, so I'm now going to try and find some more clear road and keep enjoying it, because this is great. Thanks for watching, everyone. Which little hot hatch would you have? Please leave a comment below, hit the like button if you haven't already, and please do subscribe, especially if this isn't the first video of mine that you've watched, because it really does make a big difference to me and the channel. We hit 30k recently, and I'm overjoyed about that. Next step, 50. See you there. Bye-bye.